decision to leave. This separation was a voluntary separation. But what if you find yourself in a season of an involuntary separation? What if your situations, your issues, and your circumstances put you in a position in which the separation was not a decision you voluntarily made? The woman with the issue of blood was involuntarily separated from her community and from the temple because according to the Levitical law, she was considered unclean due to her issue of constant hemorrhaging, which is similar to a woman on her menstrual cycle. I am sure that during this season of separation, she too cried, was sad, unhappy, lonely, angry, felt ostracized, and even depressed. We seldom can take this time of separation for granted because it can feel as though we are missing out on something that everyone else seems to be doing or attaining. It can sometimes feel as though we are on the outside looking in. But I stopped by here this evening to let you know that even when separation doesn't feel good, there is a huge blessing in this season. Your conscience is awakened to the strength and power of God within you. You learn how to be your own cheerleader. You learn not to rely on the validation of others around you, but the validation of who God says you are. You can't hear or entertain the negativity that others might bring to you. You learn how to pray for yourself. You learn how to pick yourself up and make yourself keep on going. Your mind and spirit are strengthened and you begin to draw upon the strength from God, which in turn causes you to notice and rely on the strength you now find within yourself. The folks you have been separated from may try and make you feel otherwise, but that's only because they are unconscious to what truly lies within them. In Lordship and Bondage, the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, he names the independent conscious, whose essential nature is to be for itself, as Lord. He names the dependent conscious, whose essential nature is simply to live or to be for another, as the bondsman. We can understand this relationship as the slave and master relationship, with the bondsman as the slave. He goes on to say that the Lord relates himself immediately to the bondsman through a thing that is independent, for it is just this which holds the bondsman in bondage. And his chain from which he could not break free in the struggle, thus proving himself to be dependent to possess his independence and thinghood. The master will relate himself to the slave through a false perception, keeping the slave in bondage. And all the slave really has to do is recognize that the false perception is really a chain that it can break itself free from. We can become slaves to false perception of security, false perception of privilege, the false perception of elitism, the false perception of superiority, the false perception of supremacy, the false perception of self-worth, the false perception of self-esteem, all for the master of validation. This is a false sense of consciousness. This limits the role of being capable of understanding or the role of playing in the restoration in consciousness when going back into our communities. Could it be that our own communities still have a sense of oppression because the individuals who have been called to be set apart, to play a part, don't seem to be coming from their heart? Are those with the responsibility of teaching and leading the community out of an oppressive state of mind still oppressed themselves? Naeem Akbar says that our limitations rest only in our ignorance, and we have the need to gain consciousness, and only in consciousness is our true capacity open to us. So what I like so much about the woman with the issue of blood is that in her separation, she became go back into her community without allowing the false perception to become her master, but rather knowing that God was her truly master. Amen. Brothers and sisters, here at this Mecca called the Interdenominational Theological Center, we are all here separated in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Whether it is separated from the location of our families and friends, separated from that embedded theology that we once held so tightly onto, separated financially from the income and lifestyle we once knew, separated from our former ways of living, separated from relationships, and even feeling a separation from ourselves. We all now have the responsibility to awaken our minds, bring it back to our hurting communities so that we may lead them in the direction of restoration and peace. Frederick Douglass says, knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. So consider yourself educated.
The New Revised Standard Version of Judges